Hi there. I'm Joel. I'm the executive director for ZERO1, as Jamie indicated. I'm not a futurist or a specialist in any way, shape, or form as it relates to the future, but as an artist, I think the work that one does as an artist is always somewhat speculative about a response to the sort of contemporary condition that one lives in. So I think in that sense, you're always looking to what those implications down the road are as it relates to the kind of creative practice that you're engaged with. As a director of this enterprise called ZERO1, I thought maybe I'd just share a little bit of backstory there because it might help frame this discussion somewhat. ZERO1 is now a 12-year-old organization, even though we opened our facility September 12th, our first time we've actually had a kind of physical plant home for the organization. The organization itself is 12 years old. And it came from a brainchild of Andy Cunningham, who was a bit of a marketing communications maven here in Silicon Valley, who worked directly with Steve Jobs on the launch of the Macintosh computer and later went on to form Citygate Cunningham Communications, a Sandhill firm. Did quite well for herself and is today president and CEO of Byte Communications up in San Francisco, an international communications company. But in mid-1990s, she, as a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, as her focus project, organized an event in Los Angeles called the Interactive Media Festival. And it was funded by Motorola. And in that enterprise, she selected a group of curators who went out and traveled the world to sort of find next best cool things to showcase at the festival. And they found this guy named Mark Andreessen, who was working on this thing called Mosaic. And it was first publicly featured in the context of this art exhibition. And whether it was a forecast of the future or whether it was an indicator, one can speculate. But at that moment in time, of course, Motorola could have probably paid $50,000 and owned the universe, but somehow didn't see it. Somehow didn't see that as being part of the horizon line. So ZERO1 sort of grew out of this notion of this relationship that artists sort of bring to the table in terms of being provocateurs and radical experimenters and risk takers, all values deeply ingrained in Silicon Valley culture. And from that, we emerged the ZERO1 Biennial, and now this physical platform that we will use in an ongoing way to bring artists together with sponsoring institutes and research centers and companies and cultural organizations to work on innovation problem sets and see what can emerge from their enterprise. So that's just sort of a little bit of a backstory as the context. My biggest hope could also be my biggest fear. I'm not sure. My biggest hope for the future in some ways is that we will somehow, there will be a sort of new, crazy, unpredicted, radical, I won't say discovery, but event or cataclysmic opportunity where something happens completely unexpected that we really were not projecting, and that it will be of such magnitude that it will be a paradigm shift on a scale really very difficult for us to comprehend. And I was trying to think, well, what would an example of something like that be? And it could be as simple as, I don't know, the discovery of alien intelligence. And then everything flips. Literally everything flips on its head. And, where the politics, the economy, the social space, the cultural space, all have to adjust in some deep, radical way that potentially has a whole new set of opportunities with it, but also a whole set of really deep, complex problems. So it's both a hope and fear, but there was the gold rush, there was irrigation, there was this discovery of the, not discovery, but the invention of microprocessor and so on and so forth. So, events of huge magnitude that simply change the paradigm of who we are, what we think, what our expectations are, and how we will address those. That's my hope. I want to live to see that, or be in the turmoil of it. Anyway.
We might discover human intelligence. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah. Or at least understand it a little better. Yeah.
How profound would that be? So I'll just jump in now. I want to start by giving a little bit of background on the map that we helped create with Jamie and company here at ZERO1. So we started out early on talking about this thematic of seeking Silicon Valley, and often it's discussed in terms of geography. Where do we find it? Is it a place here? I mean, this is the way people talk about it. Where does it start? Where does it end? What are the boundaries to it? And really, it's an idea, as we sort of, many people talk about it as kind of a culture and an idea. But we also wanted to think about it as a time or a chronology, and the idea of seeking Silicon Valley throughout the future, seeking it in the future. Where is it going to go? Where is this idea, this concept going to move forward, and how is it going to move forward? So with that as a sort of guiding force, we created this map, and using some of the methods that I was trained in. I am a futurist. I'm not an artist, but I've done some art-like things, so we're all sort of, and everyone thinks about the future, so in a way we're all futurists to that degree. We just don't all do it very well, but we try, right? So what I've been trained in is to try to do it better, is to try to find theories, methods, practices, mindsets to look ahead more effectively, more usefully, to try to actually create a preferred future out of the range of possibilities that we encounter and that we can actually think about. And so what we try to do is overcome one of the major biases against thinking about the future, and that is that the future doesn't exist. I mean, I have a PhD in future studies, but it's not an empirical science. People ask, what do you actually study? Well, the future doesn't exist, right? What does exist, however, are images of the future. So the ideas, beliefs, values, approaches, the ways that we imagine the future. We can look at those, and we can look at those effectively. And we know that all of us have many different visions of the future. On planet Earth, there are billions and trillions of different kinds of ideas about the future. So one of the things we try to do is parse that wide array of possible images that we have into some kind of meaningful format, category, a way of understanding those. And so a way to do that is to look at archetypes or generic kinds of futures. And so what we do, one of our methods is to look at categorize any image of the future that you come across. So I'm going to give you a micro lesson in future studies. So you'll leave today with the ability to recognize different archetypes of change. So we look at 4 generic types or shapes of change, and those are growth, collapse, discipline, and transformation. So growth as a future, that's the official future of every government and business that exists, more or less, right? It's the default future that we carry. The future is going to be like today, except more of whatever. If it's more Apple computers, or if it's more economic growth, GDP, we need to grow. And so we are always encountering those kinds of futures. And you'll often hear people talk about, oh, I'm going to give you a set of 3 different futures. Well, they're small, medium, and large growth. They're not really 3 different types. They're 3 flavors of the same kind of future. The second is collapse, and we know those stories as well. So it could be a natural disaster, it could be a pandemic flu, it could be an economic collapse, an environmental collapse we often talk about around, especially around here. And so any kind of collapse story where civilization basically is in a sense destroyed. Our life as we've known it is erratically changed forever, usually by some kind of major event, but it could be a slow collapse. The third kind of builds out of those two. So if unchecked growth, which is one story, leads to a collapse, that we've overshot and collapsed, we've overused our resources, a response to that is the third type of scenario, which is a discipline story. So that is constraining our consumption, our behavior in some meaningful way to try to keep us from, we can't grow because that's unsustainable, but we don't want to collapse. We don't want to ruin everything and start from scratch in a sense. So let's try to balance and sustain. I mean, sustainability, it often falls into this category where behavior is attempt to control and limit that. China's one-child policy is the classic example, right? So if population growth is going to lead to negative outcomes, how do we constrain that? And in China, the constraint was one child per couple. And then finally, transformation stories. And those are the major shifts. Those aren't the little incremental kinds of changes. That's when, sort of like what you're talking about, a massive change in everything that we do, where the past and the future look totally different. So you can think, well, these don't happen very often. You can imagine a few of them in history. So moving from a hunter-gathering society to an agricultural society. So where we moved from nomadic life of subsistence into agricultural life where we could live in one place, we could grow crops, we could divide labor, we could build a hierarchical system, we could build these religions, we could build monumental architecture. All of those things were predicated by the domestication of plants and animals. Agriculture to industry, where we moved to machine time and speed and clock time and all of these things that came with mechanization of society. And around here, the biggest transformation story you hear about is probably the singularity, or when machine intelligence become greater than human, and machines can recreate and create their own machines from that point and become creative entities, and that speeds up change even faster, and then we're sort of through the looking glass at that point where change happens so fast we're not even able to keep up. And so that kind of transformation story you hear about quite often. So you can imagine all of the futures and future images that you encounter, and now you can sort of say, okay, well that sounds like a growth story, or yeah, that model looks like a constraint or discipline story, or that's a transformation story. And then you can interrogate what they're not talking about and saying, okay, well have you thought about this? Yes, that's a really compelling growth story, but there are also compelling collapse stories that you need to think about in our planning and strategy. So if you're planning for a single future, that's a dangerous thing to do. It's like a monocrop, right? One event, one thing that happens or shifts, and your plans are shot, and you're left scrambling. So looking at this wide array of possibility space allows you to think about the future more robustly. So we did that with this map, and we looked at 4 alternative futures within those archetypes for Silicon Valley, and created artifacts for each one of them. So artifacts from the future are either graphical or material instantiations of those possibilities. So if we look at, we want you to be archaeologists of the future. If you see this artifact, you say, okay, well, what kind of future, what kind of world exists where that is possible in it? And often, as I said, the future is an abstract concept, so we have a hard time, what we say, bridging that gap, the experiential gap between what we can understand and experience now and that future state that we really need to have some kind of cognitive purchase on that future. Well, ways of creating either through performance or art or these artifacts, other ways of bridging that experiential gap where we can take people into that future, where they can feel it almost viscerally in their gut. If we're able to experience a future emotionally, you can go back and intellectually sort of piece it together. But I think you're going to have a different relationship to that future than you would if someone stood up here and told you. So we create these artifacts from the future to try to bridge that experiential gap, to try to get you to think about what kind of people and what kind of world actually exist in these places. So that was sort of, in a sense, give you a background on what I do, how I think about futures, and how we communicate these futures with people, and how arts and performance and all of these things are absolutely important for us to be able to think usefully about the future and then act on it as well.
Well, it's my turn, and I feel like a 5-year-old sitting on the high stool. My name is English Luuk. I'm passing around a show and tell, which is my latest book, available on Kindle. But it's a part of a series that my colleagues and I have put together over the last 20 years, looking at the cultures of Silicon Valley. And we called this project the Silicon Valley Cultures Project. And my piece in that is I was trained by people who came up with a name that you will hear in this room and maybe 5 other places in your life ever, which is I am an anticipatory anthropologist, which means that I'm interested in looking at how the past kind of takes us into the present. We gather up those values and things that affect our decision making, but we also have practices that we don't even think about. I mean, most of us aren't aware of our values. We certainly aren't aware of our practices. They're so habituated in what we do that it's really hard to see them. And so it takes kind of an outsider, like an anthropologist who's kind of mentally deranged and permanently an outsider, to look at us and go, what do we do and how do we make those futures? Because I think one of the things that unites our group up here is that we don't just passively walk into the future and it happens to us, that we are creating it, we are making it. So the degree to which we understand our past and our present helps us understand what we're doing in the future. When I thought about those questions about what is my greatest fear and hope for Silicon Valley, I had to think about, well, what the heck is Silicon Valley? I've spent 20 years thinking about that. I bet every one of you has a different definition of it. And I wanted to ask you, how many of you live in Silicon Valley? What does that mean? Is it that you are working in a high-tech industry, that you are living somewhere between San Francisco and Gilroy, that you have a mindset which allows you to be self-experimental? I mean, all of those things. And we've interviewed probably close to 1,000 people now or more, and shadowed hundreds and thousands of hours of people. And they're constantly navigating between those 3 concepts, that Silicon Valley is a place you live, Silicon Valley is a kind of economic entity, and Silicon Valley is this, oh, what's new, what's experimental, what's interesting. So when I think about the future of Silicon Valley, what is it that I'm hoping for? That some of the things that may be invisible to that culture happen in the future. And 2 things that I think don't get thought of as much are the absolute willingness to be experimental, to just play with this. I always sound strange when I say this out loud. To play with yourself, to be playful with the world and with your ideas. And I think one of the hidden pieces of the lives of people who are living in Silicon Valley is a kind of creativity, a kind of play that happens. Not necessarily, I've gone into Adobe, and this is being taped, so I probably shouldn't say things like that, where managers hand out little Nerf guns and say, go play, this will make you a better worker. And the workers are going, oh, come on. What they do is that they have their own forms of play. They have their own forms of creativity, which may be in music and art and fantasy and fanime every May right down the street. That those are the kinds of things that really fuel that creativity. And maybe they're playing with their own biology. As this book floats around the room, people are very creative about their well-being, their health, what they do with their bodies, what they do with their cognition, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. It's a very engaging place. The other piece of that story is deep diversity. We are an extremely diverse place. I live in South San Jose, which, according to the census, is the least enclaved place in the United States, which means no one ethnic group dominates it. It's like every other house, some other culture. And somehow we all go to school and go shopping and kind of don't kill each other very often. And as an anthropologist, I can tell you that's rather remarkable, to have so much difference. And yet the difference, we've found ways to work with that difference. Now, this is not, if you live here, it's not some kind of paradise, but it is an interesting experiment in really tolerating difference. If you go to Portland, Portland has a tagline. Do you know what it is? Keep keep Portland weird. I'd like to keep Silicon Valley open. Keep us open to ideas and open to other cultures and trying on new things and experimenting with ourselves and with the future. So the other place I look for the future as an anticipatory anthropologist are the people who are making the future. And you're thinking, oh, I'm surely talking about the Steve Jobses of the world. No, I'm talking about kids and teenagers. Those are the ones that are growing up and creating the culture that will be Silicon Valley. And those folks are really experimenting with what it means to be who they are. Some of that is being a teenager, just sort of playing with your identity. And some of it is happening in a way that I don't think is happening in very many places in the world. Experimenting with the concept of the difference between machine and human, male, female, different ethnicities. People can try on different cultures without having it as part of their heritage. They're decoupling your heritage, what you're supposed to be born to be, and what you want to be. And part of that is done through art, part of that is done through play, and my hopeful future is that keeps happening. My unhopeful future, the future I fear, is that we will grow culturally too mature, too old, too set in our ways, and that we will stop having that openness that will allow us to keep taking new ideas from different parts of the world, new people from different parts of the world, and turning those ideas into something transformative and creating those disruptive innovations. In other words, and again, I'm aware that this is being taped and might go live, but that we become Detroit of 10 years ago. Now, I think Detroit now is actually reinventing itself, but that we become the Detroit that was still holding on to the old auto industry and the old ways of doing things. And what happened to that Detroit? Has anybody gone to Detroit? Have you seen what Detroit is like? It's kind of like Mordor. There are parts of it that are really pretty astonishingly not so good. And that could be our future. And that's a future I don't want to see happen here.
So I'm just sort of thinking about all the opening remarks, including my own, and quite honestly, a bit of the romanticism that goes with all of this and any discussion about the future. When, if we just look right outside our doors, we see that the future for many, many people is, what am I going to eat tonight? And am I going to have a place to live tomorrow? How am I going? Are my kids going? Yeah, and it's the experimentation, the play, the four ways of imaging the future. Is it perhaps a kind of luxury that comes with a bit of elitist positioning? Of being able to participate in that kind of activity as it relates to your reality, when inventing the future really, for many people, has to do with how they are going to survive in the immediate. Now, I understand, of course, that as an action or an experiment is also a kind of forecasting and a shaping of tomorrow. But that's a tomorrow that's a rather difficult one. So one of maybe a fifth category of imaging the future is that nothing happens. It just keeps going on, and in a sort of not so. There's a kind of fluidity to what happens, and things have gotten to the point of no return, a bit like climate change, where there's not the damn thing anybody's going to be able to do about it, really. Not really, In the end, we lost that battle. Are we losing the battle of the future?
So the fifth, if I can restate and correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of a no future place where we're just responding to what's in front of us, basically, right. And then we can't really even imagine or think about anything beyond. And that's not just the state of poverty either. We often think about that in a kind of subsistence format or scavenging format where we're just sort of shuffling for it. But there's people, Joy Ito and others, talking about nowism, that things are happening so fast that we can't even imagine what's coming next. I mean, basically, the future is here all the time, so we don't have to imagine the future. We are living it, sort of opposite of what I said before. So that idea of a no future is played out on both ends. It's almost a no future out of luxury, because we've created ourselves a system that's accelerating so fast that we're not able to sort of cognize that future in time, and we're just basically reading and responding to it. There's also an aspect of this that's, and it's in a make the future zone. It's just the best, Alan Kay said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So you just do. It's sort of the version of do-ocracy. Well, it's do-futuring. You're creating, whatever you're creating is going to be the future. And you don't respond and try to understand and analyze it. You just make it. And that's sort of what we advocate as well, too. But I think we still need, even in a time of accelerating change, we talked a little bit earlier about this metaphor of mountain climbing. So even if I want to go to the top of that mountain, and I don't know how I'm going to get there necessarily. And every step on the way, I may not be able to predict exactly what it's going to look like. But I know that if I keep making progress in some format, that I'm going to get there. So we often say, it's kind of one of these lines in the business, that it's easier to forecast 10 years out than it is 1 year. Because you can see that long-term future. You can see that it's coming. 10 years ago, we could have said, portable computing and network devices, it's going to go mobile, right? But we didn't know exactly how that was going to take place, or that Apple would be a player, or that Nokia would go south, and all of these things. We couldn't say exactly year by year, minute by minute how we're going to get there. But if you look long term, you can say, yes, that's the general direction things are going. So it's sort of this bifurcation where near term feels very just now and we're making it, but you can still keep a longer term and see the kind of the general shape of change where we're going.
Just to speak loud, which is normal for me. I thought there, you mentioned the future we predict is the one we create, and you had mentioned that sometimes Silicon Valley is also it can be a bit of an elitist bubble. But maybe to have the space to invent the future, we need a place where we can get crazy and weird and have a little shielding, so we can take the chance of experimenting. So maybe you need enclaves, even if they get a little isolated, elitist, or weirder than necessary, in order to have that space to invent.
And
I don't know what weirder than necessary is. I'm willing to experiment to find out.
Yeah.
Well, welcome to the garage.
That's what I was going to say. Art is that kind of space, too.
And I want to kind of disabuse us of the idea that only the wealthy people can innovate, and that innovation means that you have invented a new thing. I think that one of the undertold stories of Silicon Valley is less about the junk that we make than it is about the way we experiment with our social relationships, with creating partnerships, with kind of working our way through different kinds of social relations. Whether you like the future that we've created that is based less on old institutions than social networks, it is a future that we have helped create here. And so it isn't as if only the elite innovate. And I would actually argue that as someone who looks at human behavior, that sometimes the most innovative people are the ones that are at the edge, because they have the most to gain from innovating. And that's why I worry that our own prosperity will make us too complacent, because then there's no motivation to innovate, or what we think is innovation is just, coming up with another piece of junk.
So the other aspect of that is that this notion about creativity, which is also an incredibly loaded term, in a very similar way to innovation, which we use in a variety of contexts. And as you mentioned earlier, I mean, everyone here would have a different, maybe set of ideas about what those things are. But clearly, I think clearly, the nature of creativity itself is shifting. It has become more participatory, and it has become more collaborative. And I would maybe argue the diversity factor is also playing out right before our eyes. So how do you both see that changing landscape of creativity? And is it a social transformation that might have that paradigm shift that you mentioned earlier?
The simple lowering of barriers to creativity, where much of what's been invented here has enabled people to both have the tools of creativity, simple things. I mean, being able to write a blog, just to go back and publish your ideas so simply, and have an audience of millions or billions of people. That idea that where creativity can be found now anywhere, and that it can be cultivated, and that people have an outlet for that. So the middlemen that have been reduced along this way between a producer and an audience, or even a consumer, if you want to think about it that way, but those barriers now and those filters and those middlemen that were in the middle now are being reduced. So I think people have both the tools to create, and then they have support and audience and other people that will help them create and fuel their creativity and be inspired. That's the other end of it, right? I can see things that I never would have before, and that can spark an idea. And so this kind of marketplace of bits and pieces of ideas and people and tools together, I think, has really has expanded our capacity for creativity.
Yeah, and I'm an educator, so I'm going to say some heretical things, which is, I'm kind of in the business of creating experts by giving people degrees that say, and now you're an expert in the discipline of anthropology, or whatever it happens to be. And in many ways, the changes that Silicon Valley has helped shape have taken us back to an era maybe 150 years ago, which was the glory days of the amateur. I mean, my field 150 years ago, anthropology, was a bunch of people who were basically clergy in Europe, who were supported by the state, who were kind of inventing paleontology and anthropology and architecture, but they were all amateurs. And there wasn't really the expertise. There wasn't someone to say, oh, you can't think about things like that. I'm an expert and you're not allowed. And many of the things that have happened, even in the past decade, have allowed a kind of rebirth or a renaissance of the amateur, where people get to play with things that they don't really have a right to play with according to our credentialing system, but that doesn't mean that they can't be creative in that. And I think that is a very interesting thought to pursue. What's going to be the consequence? Because the consequence of the last golden age of the amateurs was the world of the 20th century. So what is this new golden age of amateurs going to produce?
Many companies and there are many people has been studying and trying to predict future over the years. And there are certainly cases where there are a lot of failed futures, right? How do we learn from these past studies and things that has been reinventing over and over again? What can we learn from this kind of practice? And I'm curious your thoughts.
I'm going to jump in that, and then probably Jake will want to jump all over that. When I talk to my classes about forecasting, I tell them to eliminate the word predict from their vocabulary, because that's kind of pointless, even though I do enjoy the crystal ball image from time to time. The idea of thinking about the future is not whether or not you produced a future that happened, but whether thinking about the future made you behave in a different way, a more aware and more conscious and more engaged and more sophisticated way. So those catastrophically funny failed futures, like, oh, we only need one computer for the whole world, or we only, we really want to have, and this is one of my favorites from Herman Kahn from the mid-20th century, a nuclear war would be excellent for the American economy. Those kinds of, wow, somebody actually said that, makes us now think, why is that such a stupid thing to say? And the act of saying, why is that such a stupid thing to say, I think is a very useful thing. So in many ways, thinking about the future is less about being right than about being aware and making somewhat better and somewhat broader decisions based on thinking about different alternatives and consequences.
So there's a phrase, I keep giving you these little aphorisms, but I think they're useful. There's a phrase in the field that says that people tend to have what's called a crackpot realism of the present. So sociologically you can see that, but also there's actually neurocognitive reasons for this as well. But we basically see the future in terms of the present and to some degree the past. So our experience basically guides cognitively what is thinkable about the future. And so we are often stuck in whatever's sort of happening around us. So if I'm, in March last year and Fukushima happens, I can't see a nuclear future. That's insane, right? I'm sort of stuck by the events and what my mind is sort of latched onto. So for organizations and company, they have that kind of pervasive presentism or pastism where everything's been working so far, it's been going great, and they aren't even able to cognize or think about other directions that they could go or need to go. And so people get stuck in that. And so part of the practice of what we do is to try to break that, is to break that crackpot realism, is to try to either through provocation or some other kinds of intervention is to say, it's not going to be like that. You're planning for a future that's very, very likely not going to happen, especially in a world of accelerating change where there's more novelty, where the past is not a good precursor to the future. So I think it almost takes force. It almost takes real intention to break that sort of bias that we have about thinking about the future in terms of the present.
And certainly, I guess I would just add to this sort of thread is that artists bring to the table not only the provocation, but the iteration of the present. Mm-hmm. And through that, those iterations become bifurcated at different moments, in many ways very accidentally. So, and that iteration becomes a very important part of the process of trying to attempt to understand the contemporary condition while simultaneously, finding the cracks that allow you to walk through that possibility of what's next.
Well, what often happens is that mind shift, which in my work what it would say would be to defamiliarize the present. So to make the present strange. We sort of take this as the world had to be this way. It's inevitable that it came to be this way. Well, no. It was a set of contingencies along the way and events and interactions and decisions that made the present. And the present is a fugitive, weird place, if you think about it that way. And art often creates that mind shift where it says, okay, the ground beneath my feet is not what I thought it was. Why is the future like this? And makes you question at that level.
One way to think about the Silicon Valley is, as you were saying, Jan, that it's, what is it? Is it geography? Is it people? Is it processes or whatever else? But another way to think of it is globally, that what we're doing in the Silicon Valley is being impacted by what people are doing in other areas where they're trying to innovate, whether it's technologically, politically, and other areas. How do you think that Silicon Valley is going to react to the pressures from outside and either stagnate, like you suggested would be a danger, Jan, or actually grow and absorb what's coming from elsewhere?
Boy, that is the question. A long time, kind of midway through my relationship with the Institute for the Future, I was working on a project with some of your colleagues, and they were talking about the global Silicon Network, that it was really a mistake to even talk about Silicon Valley as if it were a different place. It is part of a flow of people that come from other, we have a word in social sciences, it seems you've got a bunch of scholars here, we have vocabulary we're throwing at you, technopoles, places which are heavily influenced by technology and by the way of thinking about technology. And that, we're one of them, and there are a bunch of others, and they, slap silicon or digital in front of their names, and you have Silicon Bog and Silicon Plains. And I've gone to some of those to try and look at their relationship to the degree to which they are sort of enacting the way we live. And the way to think about it is that we are a portal. We're using a technological metaphor, we're a portal to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world flows through here. When I first started studying Silicon Valley about 20 years ago, there was this little debate, is Silicon Valley American know-how, or is it immigrant energy? And my answer is yes. So there's something going on here that kind of takes the very American, very, very Californian ideas about progress and optimism and romanticism and enacts them. And that kind of drew people, along with the money, from all over the world. Now, I hate to be such a social scientist about it, but to the degree to which we have a functioning system of immigration has a lot to do with our future. Can we actually process visas before people die and grow old or go somewhere else? We have a somewhat broken system for that, and it's very political and very contentious. And if that valve gets shut off, we're actually going to be deeply in trouble, because we do need people from all over the world to flow in here. We need dollars from all over the world to flow in here. We need technology from all over the world to flow in here. So the degree to which we become ossified and start creating barriers and think of ourselves as something other than a hub, other than sort of the center of a network, then I think we are really endangering our future.
Can the panel maybe just speak on some of the more social justice challenges? We have a diverse population, but there's some segregation, based on class. In terms of, is there the creativity or social innovations taking place on these social realms? Any thoughts or observation in that realm?
Well, I'll kick it off. I didn't even say what my hope was for Silicon Valley. But it is just that. It's again sort of the hope and fear at the same time. My hope and fear, my fear would be that if what we're doing here has no impact on improving people's lives, that it doesn't have an impact on transforming our political systems, which are woefully inadequate to deal with the 21st century problems, in my view, climate change, social justice. If we don't transform the world, and I think network technologies are going to be part and parcel of that, then I think we've failed as a place. So I think it has to happen, and I think a network society is potentially the most transformative idea, concept, way of organizing human political structures, organizational structures that we've invented in a long time. I think it, and I think it will. I think we will transform basic human systems by this new model, and it's happening in everything. You mentioned education. That's one that I've been thinking about recently. So. Access to knowledge and open courseware and all of these open tools that people have now that allow anyone. I was just in Malaysia, and their government there is going headlong into an open educational model where they're going to encourage and allow and create a platform for their students to learn from the best globally. And that's very exciting. A kid in rural Malaysia now could have access to the best mind at MIT and learn something, and then there's a structure around that where it's not just watching a video, but it's also cultivating that person throughout their lives. So great potential there within this network model, unless we start cording it off and putting up artificial barriers. We need to find a way to not just build it, but again, that kind of orgware or other stuff that needs to exist, the culture that needs to build around it to push us forward.
Yeah, go ahead.
A term that keeps coming into my head as I'm listening to the discourse is Californication. And we are, 47th, 48th in the nation in terms of public education. I know exactly what that means, I think that obviously that can be interpreted in a whole number of different ways. But somehow this place, this idea, this Silicon Valley that we're speaking to in the immediate local hasn't really lived up to the promise in so many ways. And that's curious to me, why that is the case. I mean, what is it that's prohibiting that transformation from occurring at a more rapid rate than it is? Not just in education, but then we have to look at healthcare. We have to look at the whole range of issues, and then it goes back to I think where we start. It's like in part of the projection forward, the idea of the future, the image of the future, really is centered in value. And what do we value today that will begin to put the paving stones in place for a future that is possibly realizable, given that you're going to zigzag your way there. And so, if we look at California as part of the phenomena, look what everything that we've given the world is such wonderful stuff, right? Yes, Silicon Valley-ness, but Hollywoodness, West Coastness, suburban single-track, one-story homes. There's a whole range of sort of manifestations of the iterations of experiments that are occurred here. But it's always curious to me, it's like, why are we not out a couple steps in front of these social justice issues in a deep policy way to sort of make impact and set a new model?
I'm going to jump in, and then I see. Okay, go ahead. Well, I just wanted to comment because your question is my work. And that is, as an anthropologist, that's kind of what we're right front and center and thinking about. And it's the flip side of the other question, which is I worry about sealing ourselves off from the world, but I also worry even more about sealing ourselves off from ourselves. And the missing million is the phrase that's used in people who look at this region for people who aren't part of the dream, who are living in poverty, who really don't see a future for themselves in this area and a future for themselves as educated people. Now, having looked at those kids, they're actually a lot more innovative and hopeful than we think they are. But nonetheless, it is a grave problem, and one that I think is in part because of kind of thinking about what you were asking why, because we are a place where people flow through and they aren't necessarily invested in this place as a future, and they aren't necessarily acting on this place to build it up because, well, they don't know if they're going to be here in 10 years. They don't know they're going to be here in 20 years. For me, my metaphor for how this place engages with the future, which is often very romantic and flying cars, but it's this is the place that invented the tilt-up. The tilt-up as an architectural form. Wow, that's designed to last, what, 10, 20 years? Now, what does that say about our investment in this place infrastructurally? And we don't necessarily think in a very systematic way, or we have so many barriers to acting on those thoughts. It's not as if people aren't thinking about those and studying it and acting on it. And in many ways, acting on it from the bottom up, that seems to be the most hopeful thing. Yes. You were.
Actually, you said a lot of things I was going to say. Thanks. But I would add one thing with the integrating people. I think it's because we have different cultural concepts of Silicon Valley. When I moved here, my intention was to die here, hopefully at a good ripe age, not in a terrible car accident. But if we're going to be a hub, we need people that are keepers to keep the hub in shape. Yeah. And that is something that's often missed. You have to make a commitment, like this place makes a commitment to the people, to the culture, and there have to be people who are going to stay. Silicon Valley welcomes you in, but doesn't always try to figure out how to get you to be here 40 years from now. Yeah. We're used to thinking people will stay.
As an advocate of that looseness, and some of that lack of infrastructure, I think is a good thing. And I think it's why people can flow through here. So if you think about a platform model, you just need enough to support people, but let them sort of flow in and let their intelligence come and go as they please. So you don't want to ossify any of the culture or the sort of the legacy too much, because I think that's what's one of the great things about it is it is a little bit blank in that sense that people can come in and kind of make their own way. So it's a balance. You want to keep enough support there to allow things consistently over time, but you don't want to sort of ossify anything and make rules and where people have to come in and follow those rules. You want to allow it to be sort of loose and emergent.
Was there one piece in the exhibition that made a light go on for you? Something in the space around us we should see before we leave and look at it in a different way that you might shine a light on for us?
You're directing that to any of us? Oh, God, I'm in love with the exhibition. Oh, gee, the sort of light went on for me on, a variety of projects. And it's really hard to sort of highlight them out because each one of these gives such, has such a backstory behind it in terms of how it's emerged a different way of thinking. I think the piece behind us, as you just mentioned a little while ago, is that Stamen has contributed to the exhibition, Stamen Design, that really looks at this transportation network and that is both a kind of transparent and opaque simultaneously to the community. That's really begs so many questions about the issues that we're talking about here and now, to sort of force us into that sort of reflection about what this idea of Silicon Valley means to us and how it is really being manifested in kind of physical ways in the present to sort of shape that future. I think this is a really good indicator of that kind of work. Whether the light bulb went on or off, I don't know. Light bulbs don't usually go off in my head very much. There is a light bulb down here that will go off on your head. That's definitely worth checking out, because if you can make that work, then I think you're there.
Watch this attempt at reframing. So I think
it's good.
I think the space itself is the light bulb, and that we've talked about Silicon Valley as a safe place to experiment. Well, this is a safe place to think about the future, to experiment, to push ourselves into different cognitive spaces than maybe we would have. So the fact that this exists and that we can come in here and it creates an atmosphere, an expectation of that kind of pushing and experimentation and play, I think is what appeals to me.
So I came in a little late, and you may have already covered this earlier, but the South Bay and San Jose has claimed itself as the capital of Silicon Valley, and we went through that transition when even the logo of the city went from this beautiful little agricultural motif to the high-tech capital motif. And yet now Silicon Valley is sort of this whole San Francisco-wide. Anybody can use the term. What does the South Bay and San Jose have as an edge on this, and how do they deserve this title, and how can they better claim it? And did you already cover that?
I think that's you, Jan.
Hey, I work at San Jose State. I have a deep commitment to the word San Jose, and anything I say can and will be used against me. But Silicon Valley isn't necessarily. One of the things that fascinates me is how does a place get a brand, and who has the right to give that brand? And so for a long time, I've looked at things like Joint Venture Silicon Valley Network that almost seems to be one of the authoritative voices that allows people to say they are in or not in Silicon Valley. And yet I think it's really the people that have that say, which is why I started out by asking whether you live here. And I could have followed on with, do you work here? Do you sleep here? What is it that the living actually means? And San Jose is very deeply involved in the living in Silicon Valley. And it has a huge piece to the middle, the middle part. It contains a lot of that missing million that don't get to actually participate in the economic wealth of Silicon Valley. But it also produces the bulk of the engineers that are hired in this valley, are produced right over there at the place where we work, San Jose State. So I'm weaseling around that answer because I don't know what Silicon Valley is, so I certainly don't know what the capital of it is. But I'm not going to disown San Jose as a right to do that, although, all you have to do is go up to Palo Alto and say San Jose is the capital of Silicon Valley to have, animal feces thrown at you. So, it's a very contentious question, but it's rooted in the idea of, well, what is the Silicon Valley, and what does it even mean to have a capital? Capital is part of a governance system that this place doesn't have, and that's part of why it works, is because it isn't it isn't part of a structure that's hierarchically organized with a capital. And And so I kind of think it isn't the capital of Silicon Valley, and nobody needs to be.